What it do, guys? It's D'Anthony here, man, aka Hood Scout, back again for another edition of the Hood Scout podcast. And this is really a unique podcast, a podcast like no other. We're going to have athletes, we're going to have coaches, we're going to have intellectuals, we're going to have media members of all sorts. And don't forget, guys, to like this podcast, share this podcast, and help grow this podcast. This is not just my podcast. This is also your podcast. And the only reason it's going to grow is because you guys are going to be invested in it, guys. Sit back, get your beverage of choice ready, get your popcorn ready, get your dinner ready, get your steak ready, get your vegan meal ready. Tune in, guys. Hood Scout. Peace. Hey, what it do, guys? What it do, man? It's Hood Scout back again. And for another edition, should I say, of the Hood Scout podcast show. We're intertwining high school sports with knowledge and education and wisdom and all that good stuff. On this episode, you guys know what February is. If you don't know what February is Black History Month. And we celebrate Black history here. We celebrate the history of many African Americans who came and forefathers of it. Believe it or not, this month was started by the scholar Carter G. Woodson, for all those who don't know. So this is kind of a different one, not necessarily a scholarly one, but one where I give my opinions. And I'm going to end with a rap article on hip hop and the impact of hip hop and the lack thereof. So sit back, guys, like the podcast, share the podcast, and man, keep supporting this show, guys. Please, please, please. Shout out to BS3, man. Let's keep this thing going. Peace. Hey, what it do, guys? What it do, guys? Hood Scout back again for another edition of the Hood Scouts podcast. I changed the name. It's no longer the Hood Scout High School Sports Show podcast. We're just going with the Hood Scout podcast because one of the big things I really wanted to do, I wanted to bridge um, education in this whole thing. Sports is cool, athletics is cool, the youth, have a love and passion for them, but I said, if we don't fuse education in this thing, I feel like in some ways we're misleading the youth. So we're going to talk a little bit about Black history, as it's Black History Month, February, but in the context of the culture right now, in the context of the African American community right now as we see it, and even in education as we see it. One of the things that I asked, and I've been asking this question for a while, but particularly lately, I've asked the question of, within the context of education, why is it that so many of our boys have a hard time reading? Why is it that the dropout rate is so bad? I heard a guy say something I thought was very interesting. He was a psychologist years ago. He's since passed, but he said in elementary, the kids are excited about going to school. About fifth or sixth grade, that excitement starts to wane, and then once they get to high school, it's they're no longer really enjoying it, and eventually they'll drop out. So they start going to school, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, excited, ready to learn, but as they go through the system of education as we have it, it is something there that then forms almost a disconnect, especially when you're talking about African American boys. So we're gonna unpack these things. We're not gonna come at it at a scholarly perspective, but for just my opinion in some cases. Then I will read an article on something that I want to tie into this whole thing as well. But without further ado, man, let's get into it. When you look at our community now, and man, really for the past 30 years at least, maybe 40 for sure. You hear about the mass incarceration. You hear about the breaking up of the family, which those two things actually tie together when you talk about so many men being incarcerated. I think I heard a guy say there's more African American men incarcerated than there are women in the whole in the whole world. And I remember when I first heard about that, it really hit me because when you're talking about, I don't know the statistics right now. I think the last time I seen it was 700,000, 800,000, but I'm not 100% sure. But when you're talking about many of the men and the community missing, so you're talking about fathers, you're talking about brothers, you're talking about cousins, you're talking about a dysfunctional state of the community, in which is one of the reasons why mentors, coaches, advocates of the youth as men and as teachers or whatnot, they're so important because If we're not here showing the model to these youth, if we're not here showing what men are supposed to be, how men are supposed to love, that's gonna be a negative impact on them. You know what I'm saying? So we have to understand the context of all this stuff. So anyway, you're talking about that crack era. And if you don't know about that crack era, you go do the research on the drug era. And then the policies that came from the drug area. Then you talk about go a little bit back. You're talking about the creation of I won't say the welfare state, but the creation of certain laws and regulations where if the women had children, it could be no man in the house. Y'all, you can go back and look at this. I want to say this started in the 1960s, but some of these policies that were created, um, I don't even know if the people created them had ill intent. I don't know if that was pushback, but from what I see within the last 60 years, there seems to have been in so many different ways, but a push to disconnect the men from the family, disconnect the men from the boys. And that's why when you have these things like, oh, these children are so bad, and I hear that so often when it comes to education in the public school system and the community, and the kids are in the gangs and they're fighting at every turn. I don't know if this is old school rhetoric that I'm saying, but when you take out the men, you take out the fathers, be it through economics, and that's a very very crucial part, because once you take out jobs, that affects men, that affects self-esteem, that affects alcoholism, drug addiction. It ties into it, because without a lot of that employment, a lot of the men doesn't feel sufficient enough to be who they're called to be as men. But the point I'm making, that when you take out those men, whether through economics, through different means, the boys begin to feel it. And this has been a crisis that, to be very honest with you guys, that I've been thinking about for a long time, because I don't hear it talked about a lot. I don't hear it talked about at church or any of the, those type of institutions that probably should talk about these things that affect the community, since these people go there. And you might hear somebody talk about it from a passing by type of sense, but nobody really dives into the data, dives into the why, dives into what's really going on. So you're dealing with a conundrum of things. Like I said, you're incarceration, drugs, and the lack of men and all that. But I want to frame it from this perspective. I want to frame it from a perspective of unity and or the lack thereof of unity. Um, Unity is power. Togetherness is strength. And if you ever want to conquer a people, and I'm using this more of a general sense, but if you ever want to kind of conquer people, you must first disconnect the people. When you go back to the history of the transatlantic slave trade, which is, of course, as many of us know, one of the worst atrocities that has taken place in this world, which there have been many, but it's one of them. When you read about that, when you go into that, you begin to understand it from a different perspective, and that is the taking away of children from mothers. And in fact, I'll go a bit deeper, guys. This actually happened, so you had the transatlantic slave trade. Once the enslaved, strong people, but the enslaved, I won't call slave, the enslaved came to this country, this happened as well. But they would take babies from mothers. They will rip men away from women. And you got to understand, this is physical, but it's also a psychological type of thing as well. It's a psychological type of trauma that goes there too. And Dr. I think her name Joy DeGruy, she has a book on there called the Post Traumatic Slave Syndrome or something to that effect. She wrote a book on that, and she's a teacher. But you create those trauma experiences, then you get to America, through these tough situations, and once you get here, when as an enslaved person on those slave blocks, your kid is ripped away from you as a mother and as a father. Think about that mental stress. That wife is disconnected from her husband. It's a possibility that her husband was sent to Alabama and she was sent to Tennessee on those slave trading blocks. And these are situations, guys, and conversations that a lot of times as people now in the 21st century, we say that's long ago. We don't want to hear about it. It has nothing to do with us. But I think in the context of everything we're dealing with in the 21st century, we have to go back and study that to also study this. So, you had that, you had the ripping away. And what you begin to see is a type of trauma-based thing going on. And so all throughout much of history, there has been an attempt to either persuade or to disconnect from a unified perspective, or control, whether it be through means of laws, be through means of education, be through means of religion, control and disrupting the cultural identity of a people. That's kind of been something that we see. So, and the ancestors, from the enslaved time, they got out of that. They met people and they formed families. Even after the so-called destruction that has taken place, then they still came about, formed families, even in their poverty, because they didn't have much. They didn't get the 40 acres mule. They still had enough wherewithal and wisdom to say that the only reason we're going to survive these tough times is going to be to unify. So that brings me up into the 1960s and the liberation movement, and even, what we hear about modern day feminism. And what we see with that, especially feminism, I would encourage the viewers of this one, because now we're getting into, not like I said, we're not getting into just sports. Now we're getting into the big educational side of things. Go back and study the creation and the formulation of some of these things like feminism. Who started it? Not the person who started, but really who started these things, and what did it mean to the community at large. So anyway, so like I said earlier, you had those policies about when they created certain certain projects and certain housing situations, where in order for the women to receive certain benefits from the government or from the housing authority association, stuff like that, no man could be present. And maybe on the surface that sounds okay, but in essence, what you're telling me is you're willing to give something in order to help destroy something, because there's no case where you're actively promoting something, a subsidy like a house or anything like that, where you're removing also the man from it. Because once you remove the man from it, you're removing a part of the foundation. You know what I'm saying? And a foundation is something that it has to be a kind of a unified thing. You can't just have woman and a kid, because she's missing that foundational piece, as important as she is. So, through the 60s and some of these policies, you've seen the kind of persuading and the disconnecting of the family. Um, and then you've seen an era after that introduced, the drug era, the heroin, and and the way that the drugs flooded so many of these inner city communities. I said it to myself, and it's very interesting. I said, why is it that most of the inner city communities are the same? You can be in Texas, you can be in Houston, you can be in New Orleans, you can be in Miami, Florida, you can be in New York, you can be in California, you can be in Compton. Why is it that many of these communities, no matter, like I said, no matter where you are, and in fact, it's global, but no matter where you're in America, why is the quote unquote hood the same? Why does it look dilapidated? Why does it look um run down? Why isn't there healthy grocery stores? Why isn't there healthy employment opportunities? Why is there, and in fact, this is real too, drug addicts walking around stumbling, and people in drunk stupors and stuff like that? Why does that seem to be the norm? Well, you talk about the heroin, you talk about the crack epidemic, and a lot of these drugs, I don't know anyone said, being filled into these inner cities, being filled into these metropolitan areas in certain parts of town. And you got to remember, guys, from a general standpoint, especially when it comes to African American people, most African American people have roots in the country and roots in the South. So you're talking about roots from Southeast, and you're talking about roots in the country. So you have people that migrated to the cities for a lot of times economic reasons, to get better work, this, that, and the other. But even when the context of them migrating into the cities, it seems that they've been interrupted. You know what I'm saying? And the drug epidemic is one that it was devastating to a lot of people, and that's something that it's been talked about. I don't know how much, but it's been talked about. That that heroin era and that crack era. In fact, that crack era, crack cocaine was a very big thing, man. Created a lot of drug addicts, destroyed a lot of families, man. You got to understand, when you get connected with these drugs, and especially on that level, you do anything for it. You begin to rob, you begin to kill, you begin to steal, you begin to help destroy your community. And as you guys and gals remember, as I started this podcast, I talked about the destruction, the destroying. In the times of the enslaved, it was ripping the son from the mother and father. But this time it's the drugs ripping the son from the mother, ripping the father from his son. That drug epidemic. And then, that's kind of tied into prostitution because you were willing to do whatever it takes to get that drug. So you had that heroin, you had those drugs, and I had these things flooding the community, and a job word in the community, and so many different other things as well. But then I get to back to the schools as I started with. What about the schools? How important are the schools in this whole thing? Well, you're talking about dropout rates, dropout rates. You're talking about a disconnect even there. And I think one thing with education is a very powerful tool. But one thing I see even personally, and I went to charter school for a time. I went to private school, academy school for a time, and I also went to public school. So I've had the perspective of seeing all four type of learning environments. I wasn't homeschooled, but I've often asked the question, what is it that we're learning? Number one. And then I've also asked this question, who's in control of the educational system? What I mean by that is, who's on the board, the educational board, when they pass these policies about which books is going to be studied, what material is going to be read. And to be honest, that's a highly debated thing nowadays, because if you're in well, really, if you're all over, you've been hearing the quote unquote critical race theory. And some schools are taking out books, and it's kind of a big fuss about really what should be taught from a standpoint of race. But the point I bring that up is because before it was a quote unquote craze, now where everybody's wondering why. I've been asked this question: who creates education? Are these people that create education from the background of students who are suffering in education? Meaning, who has created the educational system as we see it? And then, if they have created it as we see that they have, is there a tie between the struggle of so many of the boys when it comes to education for the last at least 30, 40 years, when it comes to dropout and illiteracy rate? I think that's a serious question that you have to ask. I think parents are going to have to ask that about their children. What are they learning? And who's in control of what they're learning, and how does it affect your children? Because at some point, we have to see that it's something going on that's not right. And I'm not here to say what is, what's not, but it's something there. And I heard a statistic that said, if a child can't read by a certain age, I forgot the age, but if they can't read by a certain age, they can almost predict the building of a prison. Meaning, and I might be butchering a little bit, but in other words, by your child not being able to read, they can tie that into later incarceration. So when you understand the depth of education or lack thereof, you understand the seriousness of it. And so that's something we got to think about. Like, once again, disconnecting. And then we get to the music, the music. And everything I'm talking about is really kind of a cultural perspective, but what is the music? What is the influence of the modern music that we listen to? When I say modern, I'm talking about starting from at least the 90s up until now. I think the music is interesting. I had a guy on that talked about, he thinks some of the things that we're seeing in our communities is a result of the music. And the reason I say it like that, because when you think about, for instance, R&B music from um, the 70s and 80s, you had a lot of love songs. Then the 90s, man, That's when you really got exposed to that gangster rap culture. And this is not a bash on music, but it's just interesting because the music got really violent, it got really criminal, it got really, guns, and I'll shoot you, and I will, I sell dope and I'm making money. And I'm gonna be very honest, guys. I don't know of any other group of people who celebrate the destruction in a beautiful way. Meaning the lyrics sound, kind of sound good, they get you rowdy, the beats sound good, the the cadence of the music sound good. But when you just really stop to listen to it and it's like, I will shoot you and I'll do that. That's is that what we want to be consistently formulating? And I say it like that because what type of culture does that produce? Does that produce a disconnecting culture, like I started talking about in the beginning, or does that teach or preach a unifying message? So when you go back and you study, I can even look this up. You study the creation of gangster rap music, which started in the '90s, and um, certain meetings and things that changed hip hop culture, and even that ties into incarceration. So you see all of these things going on, and then you have where we are today. The violence in inner city. So you hear about the Chicago, you hear about the Detroits of the world, you hear about the Comptons and Inglewoods of the world. And the question we have to ask ourselves, is why are we seeing so much destruction? It is my theory that once you divide of people, you void them of love of self, love of each other, love of their parents. Once you kind of crush the economic prospects of jobs and education, true education, but jobs, you insert the drugs, you insert some of the policies the criminality, three strike policy, stuff like that. And then you start to see that the people have been disconnected. And the disconnectedness is in some cases still there. And so the bulk of this conversation, as we're coming up on 20 minutes, is how do we reconnect? And I think, I think, the everybody's, I don't want to get religious in this, but the good book, it says love. And we're gonna have to get back to learning how to love each other and how to heal, because you're talking about healing from a perspective of destruction. And this ties right into athletics too, man. I hear this a lot, and it hurts. I'm not gonna lie. And when you care for the people, it hurts. But so many of the coaches and even the athletes say, I come from nowhere. In my neighborhood, you either played sports or you sold dope. In my neighborhood, you know, it was likely that you were gonna go to jail. Why is this the norm, guys? I don't see nobody asking why. Why is this the norm that in your neighborhood you only could sell dope or play sports? Why in your neighborhood you didn't dream of perspectives of going higher? And one of the things I think too with this educational thing, it kind of pigeonhole you a little bit because you don't learn about some of the greats in history. Um, Man, you're talking about um, A.G. Gaston, man. You're talking about, I mean, just you can go, the list can go on of great inventors and great men and women who were pioneers to this country, but their story is not heard. Their story is not taught in school. A lot of this that we're seeing in these communities is a self-esteem issue. Once you demoralize the people and destroy their self-esteem, on top of not truly educating them, there's an author by the name of Carter G. Woodson. And he has a book that very popular. Carter G. Woodson was the person who actually helped formulate Black History Month. So he's actually a pioneer. But Carter G. Woodson has a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And I think that title is very interesting as it relates to education, because I think it's time for us to ask, how have we educated, or how have we miseducated, and what are we going to do to go forward from that? Um, because the next generation, according to the statistics, they're going to have a tough time economically. So these are situations that and topics that they're kind of tough to listen to sometimes, but they're needed. They're needed because I have the youth in mind. And and one of the things I said, man, as much as I love sports and high school sports and all that, man, that can't be the only way. That can't be the only way. And we're going to have to try to find a better way. And I really think in my heart it's going to have to be culturally. It's going to be have to be reconnecting with one another, respecting one another. Everybody talks about this crab in the barrel mentality. We're going to have to get rid of that, man. And at least if you can't get along with this person, the least you can do is try to respect them. I want to I want to read an academic article that talks a little bit about the music industry. So I talked a little bit about the hip hop and how that affected us. I want to read a scholarly article on hip hop, and then I think we'll just about end it because we're about on 30 minutes. And I just want this show to be long. I didn't want it to be scholarly. So this is kind of a part of my thoughts and kind of a part of just what I'm seeing in the culture. And when you see stuff, man, you got to kind of speak on it. So the title of this article is how hip hop affects reentry, and the title is called Trapped. How mainstream hip hop affects the post incarceration reentry process. So let's begin. Stemming from a desire for low income and minority people to have more political voice, hip hop history and popular culture can be likened to a fairy tale, Cinderella. Starting as a little known counterculture movement, hip hop has come to infiltrate every part of society. That's very interesting. From marketing, fashion, politics. Although it has become a cultural force in mainstream, there is still a lot of negative stereotypes associated with hip hop culture, mostly through rapping, as graffiti, breakdancing, DJing aspects of the culture are often ignored. Commentaries and critiques of hip hop are often cultural criticism of minority groups, namely Black people. Mainstream hip hop depicts certain images of criminality. That's so deep because that goes back to the images as well. What are you seeing? What are you modeling? But let's keep going. Certain images of criminality through the trifecta of gangster, the pimp, and the hoe. And these images are often used to define an entire population of people. Wow. I'll repeat that, guys. I'll repeat that. Mainstream hip hop depicts certain images of criminality through the trifecta of the gangster, the pimp, and the hoe. And these images are often used to define an entire population of people. These images have a lasting impact on dominant culture, on dominant cultural perceptions of people involved in hip hop culture, damaging their political voice, especially as those images are consumed increasingly by, I would say, different groups of people. But this article specifically said, Caucasian people. By promoting images of criminality, I'll turn the camera just a bit. Okay. By promoting images of criminality, mainstream hip hop helps justify the tough on crime mentality that has often been directed towards low income communities and communities of color. What did I say, guys? This ties directly into what I was talking about to begin. Let's continue. However, these images and perceptions persist when people are even released from incarceration. All formerly incarcerated people, not only those of color, already face the collateral consequences of incarceration, such as the lack of access to federal services, denial of job opportunities, and the inability to vote in some states. So managing their identity in a society overrun with positive and negative images associated with hip hop is an additional burden that can have a damaging impact on their chance of re-entering society. So this is talking about people who been in jail and different stuff like that. As hip hop continues to become a part of mainstream culture, it's important to critically analyze the social impact it has. And that makes me think about how I talked a little earlier about the drug epidemics, the heroin and the crack and all of that. I had a guy say, and I think he's at a good point. The music actually promotes the drugs. The music promotes the selling of crack. The music promotes the sipping of lean, sipping of syrup. The music ties right into the destruction as well. And like I said earlier, it sounds so good. The lyrics and the cadence is so beautiful, but it's disconnecting you, as I mentioned earlier. Anyway, it is especially essential to understand the popular messages that are projected through hip hop regarding communities of color that are disproportionately affected by incarceration. The anti-prison industrial complex song "Trapped" by famed political rapper Tupac Shakur inspired the title of this paper. The song speaks to the impact that incarceration has on communities of color and low-income communities, but also calls for change and for keeping the government accountable for ensuring the rights of every citizen, regardless of their criminal past. I'm still reading the article, guys. In this article, I sought to explore how the negative image projection of people of color through mainstream rap affects formerly incarcerated people's perception of themselves, their perception of how society around them perceive them. It was important to see if these perceptions and images had negative impacts on their re-entry into society, as they were forced to negotiate their identities for themselves, their community, and dominant terms. Let's continue. The dominant culture consists of any group or person with significant social capital or social power, namely Caucasian people and wealthy people. When I refer to mainstream rap, I will be referring to aspects and characteristics of the larger hip hop culture that have packed and often distorted by corporate entities for consumption by dominant culture consumers. That's a point that we cannot overlook, guys. That's a good point. I will be referring to aspect of characteristics of the larger hip hop culture that have been packaged and often distorted by corporate entities for consumption by dominant culture consumers. And I think that's a very interesting point because we have to really understand who creates this type of music, who is the record labels that want this music out there. What is their intention for this music to be propagated all over the globe? Like, really, what's the intent? Um, you know, what type of image does that create once you see a guy and all his lyrics is, "I'm gonna shoot you down. I'm gonna, I'm gonna do these type of things." And you gotta understand something too, guys. The image is very receptive. The young people are very receptive to the images that they're seeing on TV. And you have to remember that, especially those with children. Mainstream rap contains problematic images of black and brown people, but the creation of those images is usually blamed on black and brown people. All right. Let's go down and let's see. I want to start right here. We'll read this little part. People always need to negotiate their identities with communication with people from other culture or different social groups in order to make sense of interaction. Culture must always be reconfigured in the present tense in order for people to understand their surroundings. There are many theories about the process of identity negotiation, but to inform my understanding of these findings, I use three notable groups, and we're going to skip that. Okay, perfect. Let's go. So how hip hop affects reentry? Still conceived a stereotype threat in relation to the experience of Black college students. He defines stereotypes threats as the fear of being viewed as a negative stereotype toward your social group, and inadvertently behaving in a manner that conforms to the stereotype. My goodness, guys, I got to read that again. Still conceived stereotype threat in relation to the experience of Black college students. He defines the stereotype threat as the fear of being viewed as a negative stereotype towards your social group and inadvertently behaving in a manner that conforms to the stereotype. Let's continue. For Black college students, and this came out in 1999, so it's about 20, about almost 23 years ago, I guess you would say. But for Black college students, stereotype threat was present when they were reminded of racial otherness being a testing situation. Since black students are stereotypically less intelligent than their peers, while being reminded that their blackness prior to these type of tests made them conform to the stereotype and do worse on tests. Oh my goodness. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Marginalized people are always trying to negotiate their identities with people in dominant culture so that they don't conform to the negative stereotypes associated with their groups. And one of the authors or educators doing the study said, and the name I think is Tafeld, so I don't want to butcher that, noted the importance of a person's self-conception in relation to various social categories in how they negotiated their identities. It came out in 1982, this particular part. When interacting with members of another social group, individuals begin to engage intergroup behavior. In order to enhance one's self-image, people will work toward enhancing the image of the group as a whole. Additionally, to improve their own self-image as a group, will work to diminish the self-concept of another group in order to boost their own self-esteem. Stereotyping is a natural behavior of humans trying to understand their environments by placing people into groups. Thus, divisions based on different social groups inform social interactions between humans. Hip-hop culture came about as a way for low-income communities and communities of color to foster creativity and give a voice to the voiceless. Hip-hop scholars view the origins of hip-hop culture as an answer to the question, what is it like to be a problem? Hip-hop also comes from a place of innovation, not solely from deprivation. Hip-hop has traditionally been seen in dominant culture as consisting of only rapping. But hip-hop also includes graffiti, breakdancing, DJing, and rapping. Came out in 05, 08, and 2009. For traditionally marginalized people, marginalized communities, should I say, hip-hop was used as a way to bring Black voice from the margins to the forefront of political and social discourse. For many people in dominant culture, hip-hop is the only means to which they hear the concerns of the Black and brown youth. Wow, I'll repeat that one. For many people in dominant culture, hip-hop is the only means through which they hear the concerns of Black and brown youth. Let's continue. Chuck D of the rap group Public Enemy once described rap as the Black CNN in its ability to share information about the state of communities of color with dominant culture. However, still reading the article. However, these conversations about race were closely attached to their simultaneously marginalization because of their social class. Communities of color historically have been impacted by unemployment and a lack of legitimate opportunity for fiscal success. What did I say earlier, guys? What did I say? Didn't I say this before we even got to this article? I said a part of that destroying is economics. It is the lack of suitable jobs, which is one of the reasons why when you look at any hood, man, like I said, I don't care if you're talking in Florida, Louisiana, Baton Rouge, Dallas, man, I'm just, Cleveland, Ohio. You're talking about typically a lack of decent jobs in a lot of these quote unquote hoods or neighborhoods. Let's continue. Hip hop's political message is a direct descendant of the rhetoric used in the Black Power movement. Questioning the system of power that continue to disadvantage people of color despite their gains in the civil rights movement. People had concerns, and hip hop gave them the opportunity to express them with a higher likelihood of being heard. With the introduction of Public Enemy and I think De La Salle or De La Soul, political rap began to find its way into popular culture. 1994. The political rapper has come to embody the archetype of anti-rhetoric outlaw who is meant to bring about fear to both black and white upper class citizens through advocating of defiance and rebellion. This anti-rhetoric outlaw mentality used to address political and social issues is most prominently seen in the gangster rap subgenre, as personified notably by NWA, Ice-T. The most prominent example of this archetype manifestation is Tupac Shakur. Everybody know Pac. Even those born in this generation, probably know Pac. In the 1990s, Shakur introduced the dominant culture to his thug life. Very interesting. Movement, a code he promoted through music. People in dominant culture perceive thug life as promoting cavalier attitude, embracing materialism, celebrating violence as a valuable means of conflict resolution. Also, they perceived his movement as promoting violence. Shakur conceived thug life as the mentality of social underdogs looking to succeed and adopt. He did not see his image as any different than Patrick Henry rhetoric declaration, "Give me liberty." Patrick Henry said, "Or give me death." For many consumers of hip hop and artists, it still has not lost its political potential and power, especially as it has gained international prominence as an art form. Many supporters of rap and hip hop culture discuss its power to address silent current issues, such as issues as the one when hip hop was in its conception. One issue that rappers have decided to address in recent times is the prison industrial complex and the mass incarceration of communities of color. Rappers such as Shakur, Nas, KRS-One, the Wu-Tang Clan, Kanye West, and Capital X, and others have used their music as a method of starting a national conversation about the criminalization and incarceration of black and brown men and women of color. It is amazing how all of this article is coming full circle with kind of the way I began this podcast. And I didn't know what this article was going to talk about at the beginning of it, but it's coming back full circle because I mentioned incarceration. Let's continue, guys. We're coming up on 40 minutes, man. I did not know this was going to be long. It's not easy to talk for 40 minutes, guys. So support the podcast. By using rap to address the prison industrial complex and improper use of police power, these artists also subverting and undermining the criminal justice system. This public discourse has led to social and political discussion of prison reform. Through time, hip hop began to infiltrate and influence the greater popular culture. This process of hip hop culture becoming the mainstream referred to as tanning. For many of this nation, tanning process was inevitable because of white culture rhetoric, intense admiration of black culture. Hip hop began to move from just a culture event to become a social fabric, seemingly beginning with Run DMC, My Adidas, partnership between the sportswear brand Adidas and the group. after the artists like the Beastie Boys, it made hip hop appealing to a wider audience to MTV and to embrace the hip hop culture, and even if it was a whiter version of it. Let's give me a second, guys. Let's continue, man. Had to catch my breath a little bit. The process of tanning continued to penetrate the national culture through marketing, through television, through film, through fashion, and politics. Hip hop culture was prevalent in marketing campaigns for children's cereals in the 90s and 2000s, which welcomed the culture into the homes of families. Which, man, that's a very interesting point. That's very interesting, but because I would go a step further and ask, what was the impact of what they were promoting? Was that a good thing or was that a bad thing? But that's just my opinion. So let's keep going. I want to read the article. I don't want to interject much. Meanwhile, Will Smith's presence on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, the Wayans brothers on In Living Color, and Arsenio Hall made the presence of black and brown bodies in mainstream media more acceptable and commonplace. Also, the rise of films about life of communities of color, made by black directors such as John Singletary, Mario Van Peebles, and Spike Lee, legitimized black art significant in the dominant culture. Lastly, hip hop has had a prominent place in politics from different campaigns such as Diddy Vote or Die campaign. Hip hop has even made its way to the White House. Let's continue down. The tanning of United States culture has positive and negative impacts. On one hand, it has allowed for more people to participate in different elements of hip hop culture. For instance, it has helped inform racial policies, allow new generations to adopt the mentality all men are created equal through inclusivity of art. However, this media-driven culture have blinded the lines of defining space and place and have effectively begun disconnecting individuals from communities. Wow, man, this is full circle. I started this conversation talking about the disconnecting force, and this article talk about it. Mentioning it right now. Also, it has allowed for the corporation and the executives to package the message of mainstream hip hop that is disseminated to a broader audience without dealing with the ramifications of sending those messages. So, in essence, hip hop has become gentrified. That's my saying. Mainstream hip hop, in the hands of mass media executives, has become a playground for black countercultures of black gangsters, pimps, and hoes. This has led to the public critique of communities of color, codified and masked as critiques of hip hop and urban cultures that are justified by the distorted message created by mainstream hip hop. That is a great point, and that's one of the main points I was talking about earlier. So this creation of gangster rap, meaning rap didn't have to be like this. Rap, in fact, some of the old school rap was a political tool, but the creation of it was used to in essence to bastardize the culture and to further disconnect. Let's continue. Now this is a very long article, so I don't want to read it step by step, but I want to kind of see if we can frame it as we get ready to end it, because we've been talking about just about an hour, guys. We're really going. I hope you guys can understand this podcast. It's Black History Month, so this is not I have a dream speech, but this is stuff that's impactful when you understand the context of what the African American people are in, even as we talk about today. Okay, guys, let's continue. This section is called the Images of Criminality. Criminality and people who are incarcerated are often referred to by popular culture as being the worst aspects of society. Socially, people who have been conditioned to not see criminals as inhuman, not deserving of respect and rights. There is usually a boogeyman image attached to people who have experienced incarceration, in which they are viewed as bad guys deserving the worst form of punishment because they're a deviant and not normal. And it's very interesting because this was also something that was kind of perceived on the culture back in the old days to justify certain hangings and certain things of such, and certain laws as well. They, imagery play a big part in it, man. It's happened for a very long time. There is a common misperception of people who have experienced incarceration that they're unable to become essentially good. So the waste management model of justice is the goal of criminal justice system, no longer to rehabilitate or to punish, but to incapacitate. The societal beliefs about formerly incarcerated people are inherently deviant, makes it difficult for them to re-enter successfully because they are attempting to re-enter a society that has made it clear that they do not want them back to begin with. However, popular culture through mainstream rap disseminates messages of criminality of Black and brown people. Criminality is often most associated with Black people. Mainstream rap is a conversion between mostly white record company executives and dominant culture. Frequently, these images are of Black and brown people as deviant, violent, hypersexual. These entities who propagate these images of Black and brown criminality through the manipulation of their artists often avoid community backlash because their face are not directly linked to the images and messages. What did I talk about earlier, guys? Well, I did not mention how it was a lot of the artists starting to promote the guns, the killings, the selling of dope, the sipping of lean. You got to look at these images, how they tie into and how they create your mindset. The images of criminality, besides increasing record sale, helps them financially as many record and big media conglomerates such as Viacom are investors in private prisons, thus making the substantial income of mass incarceration. Didn't I begin with this stuff? Wow. I had no idea this was going to talk about that. Wow. That hits me. Like when you care, it hits you different, man. These messages have manifested into tangible policies that have impacted communities of color and low-income communities. What did I talk about, guys? I talked about it earlier. The image is there, and then that helps formulate the policies, and the destruction is usually the end goal. For example, the youth control complex in which school officials, law enforcement officers, family, community members, the media, local businesses, and other institutions treat the lives and action of community of color, low-income communities as criminal. Further, this youth control complex leads to a system of punitive social control that justifies the regulation of the lives of marginalized youth. Criminalization occurs both material and symbolic ways. Material criminalization occurs through zero tolerance policies in school that leads to the suspension of students and of police harassment. Through the stop and frisk procedures, symbolic criminalization occurs through daily microaggressions that contribute to lower self-esteem for the youth, especially youth of color. Being labeled as criminal from a young age often leads to students or youth succumbing to the expectation they have been made to believe is inevitable. Wow. Excuse me, guys. This is passion right here, man. Being labeled as a criminal from a young age often leads to the students of youth succumbing to the expectations they have been made to believe is inevitable. This connection between criminality and people of color has led to a formerly incarcerated people to identify as non-white after their incarceration. My goodness. Wow. That is a handful right there. Yikes. Another example is the war on drugs, which will be discussed in the next session, has directly tied into the mass incarceration of marginalized people. How we talk about criminals in social and political context is important. Messages in the media or about the criminality of Black and brown people lead to policies that are directly impacted these communities. However, the corporate entities that disseminate these negative images, messages do not have to deal with the consequences they produce, and they reap the financial reward. So they reap those who have stuff in prisons. I want to start right here, guys. We're coming up on an hour. I want to start right here. We're gonna start right here. And the bulk of this whole podcast and the whole message I want to talk about is, if you're a youth or if you're a parent, I want to advocate to tell your children to think for themselves. Speak positive words of affirmation. You are healthy. You are smart. You are an intellectual. You're more than just an athlete. You are a great athlete. You are a good son. You're going to be a great husband. You're going to have a loving family. We have to begin to speak these positive aspirations, guys, because we've seen the destruction of music. We've seen the destruction of drugs. We've seen the destruction of certain ideas that are promulgated through the media. But it's going to be up to us to learn how to love. It's a learning process. You don't just learn. You don't just know it. You have to learn how to forgive. You have to learn how to see this guy, this teenage guy, as a brother and not as an enemy, not as someone in a different gang, but as a brother that I respect. I am encouraging you guys to please. It is imperative that we change our mindset, because the changing of our mindset will influence the changing of our culture. And if we change our culture, we will have a better history as African Americans. Happy Black History Month, guys. Take care. Hood Scout Podcast signing off. Peace.